In early modern art, size matters. Both of these works are absolutely massive canvases. The National Gallery work, the Saltimbanque family on your right, is almost 7 feet across, 7.5 feet high. The Young Ladies of Avignon in the Museum of Modern Art in New York on the left is larger still, 8 feet tall, almost 8 feet wide. Both of these works are intended by Picasso as being major statements, not only of what he's doing, but also where he's been and where he's going. This particular screencast will focus on the image on the left, one of the more important paintings in early modern art, the Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Young Ladies of Avignon. And it will try to provide some context for the work and some insight into its meaning. Some people suggest that Picasso's Saltimbanques was inspired by a friendly rivalry with Henri Matisse that he was having that began with Matisse's Lux comme et volupté on your left. This image of an idealized world with people frolicking hedonistically in nature, a celebration of color in the south of France, seems to have been picked up by Picasso in his own, particularly in a slightly more morbid vein at this point in his career, to this group of people in an equally idealized landscape, albeit less decorative and less brightly colored. It's worth mentioning that Lux comme et volupté is relatively small, only 4 feet across, which is large in itself. Picasso's Saltimbanques then led to Matisse's Joy of Life. There's a wonderful back and forth between these two artists throughout most of their careers, and the Joy of Life seems to be his response to the Saltimbanque family. This is what people should be doing in a landscape. And again, very, very large at this point. This Joy of Life is almost 8 feet across as well. So there's sort of a back and forth, a volleying going on between Picasso and Matisse. Matisse's Joy of Life then led to the Demoiselles d'Avignon, to the Young Ladies of Avignon. And in many ways, Picasso's work this is the closest connection between the two of them, because it really tries to do many of the same things that Matisse's work did. It's a review of where he's been, it's a signal of where he's going, but in addition to that, like Matisse, it's a summary of all of his art historical influences as well. So on the one hand, it's an amalgam of his blue period work, which we see on the far left, and his rose period figures. You can see that in the Young Ladies, we have a blue background surrounded by these ochre-colored accents and peach-colored figures. Again, it's almost as if he's bringing together everything he'd been doing up to that point. On the other hand, he's staking out his claim for a place in the history of French art. And for this, we need to talk about what he's illustrating here, the subject matter. The early studies for the Young Ladies of Avignon clarify what we're looking at. These are prostitutes. There's an elder man, not old by any means, but the older of the two on the left here, and a younger man here. In some of the early prep studies, the younger man is dressed like a sailor as well. And those two figures have come to a brothel to visit prostitutes. The older man brings a book. He's brought his nephew, perhaps the younger man aside, to lose his virginity. And he's brought a book so he can read while the younger man is otherwise engaged. And what we see is the moment when the younger man has to choose between which of these women he's going to go with, and each one of them is striking a pose for him. It makes the pose in the lower right corner of the finished work make more sense because she's facing him in this one. In the final version, he's removed the figures, the male figures, and that means that the role of the visitor to the house of prostitution becomes you, the viewer. And I think this shows a strong knowledge of French art, in particular the work we started class with, Manet's Olympia, also addresses you as if you are the client that has brought her. So flowers. Picasso is doing very, very much the same thing here, and I think consciously with a nod back to Manet. This helps to place his work as the new modern scandal, the new work that will change the direction of art. It also puts Picasso's work right in line with recent developments in French art. So we can look at Degas' images of prostitutes bathing themselves, seen in awkward and ungainly positions as they clean up between clients, his privileged view behind the scenes, or Toulouse-Lautrec's various images of houses of prostitution on the Montmartre in Paris. These are elements that Picasso is making reference to with his modern image of prostitution. The single biggest influence is for Picasso. The greatest single influence for Picasso, however, is Paul Cézanne, in particular his massive picture that he was still working on around this time, The Great Bathers. Cézanne only died in 1906, and at that point this work was still in his studio. He was still pounding away on it. And there was a massive retrospective of his works in 1907 at the Awesome Salon, where we had seen the Fauves a few years earlier. And people started paying significantly more attention to Cézanne at that particular point. And what I'd like you to look at with the Cézanne is how he plays with the foreground figures, melding them with the background spaces. And this is exactly what Picasso did. At that retrospective in 1907, we've heard this quote a few times before, people asked Picasso what he thought, and he said he's the father of us all. But Cézanne's figures are not prostitutes. They are certainly meant to be idealized figures, harkening back perhaps to some golden age. By turning them into prostitutes, what Picasso does is to make them into femme fatales, and brings his work much closer in spirit to the symbolists, which we know is a strong touchstone for Picasso. And he shares with them in many ways a sort of misogynist view of womankind, blaming them for the evils of man. And in fact, in many ways, this is even stronger in Picasso's work, this idea that they are dangerous, these women, on a certain level, to his masculinity. And Picasso enhances that sense of misogyny, that sense of danger, by making the faces of the women appear as if they are masked. This is especially obvious on the far right, but really all five of them have mask-like faces. Picasso had become particularly interested in ancient, prehistoric sculpted heads from Spain, and these statues like this particular one, seems to have formed the basis for the three figures on the left of the young ladies of Avignon. And Picasso had begun to experiment with these kinds of figures in his portrait of Gertrude Stein, the great art collector in Paris, the American writer and art collector, patron of Picasso and of Matisse. So he'd already begun using, around the time of the Sultanbausch, these ancient Iberian, ancient Spanish masks for his human figures, and he applies those to the young ladies of Avignon with the idea that he's making them mysterious, this whole experience as one of mystery. A moment to talk about Gertrude Stein. She and her brother Leo Stein were prominent supporters of the avant-garde in early 20th century Europe. They were collectors of Picasso and Matisse and many other artists, and they hosted weekly gatherings of artists and writers in their Paris apartment. Here in this photo of the Steins' apartment, you can see Picasso on the wall here. This one's in the National Gallery now. And over here in the corner, you can see Matisse's Joy of Life, which belonged to her. This meeting place was one of the major ways in which Picasso got to know Matisse's work, and vice versa. In addition to his interest in ancient Spanish sculptures, Picasso's also becoming increasingly interested in African tribal art, and the two figures on the right with the colored faces certainly derive their forms from Picasso's own study of ancient tribal masks. Picasso is one of many artists who are interested in non-Western art in the beginning of the 20th century. His particular interest in African sculpture came directly from Matisse, who introduced Picasso to African art back in 1906. Remember, our Blue Nude seems to have been based on African tribal sculptures. But there's no specific African or Pacific sources that we can identify for Picasso's mask. They're not direct copies of anything. There's sort of he's channeled it. It's become a sort of personal primitivism. And in this case, they function, I think, as protection. Well, they said this, actually, that the masks were meant to function as protection against evil spirits. But what's interesting is that they're directed at you, the viewer. So are we the ones that are being scared off here? Certainly that seems to be part of the theme of the Young Ladies of Avignon. The visitor to the brothel is a frightened visitor, uncomfortable in this situation. And in fact, throughout Picasso's work, we find a sort of running theme of a fear of intimacy that we can see in a great number of his works. And adding to that is in the foreground, you can see some fruit, a little still life here. But you'll notice that the slice of melon ends up looking very, very much like a knife blade. And that adds with the sharp edges of the proto-cubist look to a sense of menace that runs through his work. Now, an interesting side note to this work and Picasso's interest in African art. His friend Apollinaire, Guillaume Apollinaire, the great poet and champion of Cubism, had a personal secretary named Henri Pierret. It doesn't matter his name, really, the secretary. And the secretary to Apollinaire used to go up to Apollinaire and his friends and say, "Hey, is there something from the Louvre that you'd like to have? If you could own it, what would you take?" And when he asked Picasso this, Picasso said, "I'd like some primitive Spanish sculpture." And the next day, Pierret showed up with 2 stone heads for Picasso that he'd walked out of the Louvre with. Makes you wonder if the African sculpture next to Apollinaire in this photo wasn't one that was nicked from the Louvre. The fascinating part of this story is that in 1911, somebody stole the Mona Lisa from the Louvre. And it wasn't Apollinaire's secretary, but he was a concerned citizen, and he went to the police. And he said, it's awfully easy to steal things from the Louvre. And he showed them just how easy it was by taking something out of there. And so he told them what he'd done, that he'd been giving works of art to, his friends, not major things, just little things here and there. And at that point, the police went to Picasso and to Apollinaire and arrested them, took them in for questioning, because they thought maybe they had stolen the Mona Lisa as well. And it's only at this point that Picasso gave back, and Apollinaire gave back the sculptures that Pierret had given them. Anyway, a fascinating anecdote from the early 20th century that Picasso was once a suspect in the stealing of the Mona Lisa. Well, our picture is really his first great step towards Cubism. His forms fragment, his solids become empty, the solids become voids, and vice versa. The number of viewpoints multiply. We see figures that appear to be lying down, but in fact are not. All of these things are the basis for what will become Cubism. But eventually it's going to take Georges Braque, to push Picasso over the edge and push him into analytic cubism. The two of them are moving in similar directions, and it would take the moment when they start to share a studio in 1909 for the next 5 years that we see Cubism come into being. Picasso certainly forges the way, but Braque brings a lot to the story as well. And this becomes one of the most fruitful artistic relationships ever. Again, our famous quote from Braque, "We were like two mountain climbers roped together." And here we are standing at the beginning